So on the board is our overall purpose. We work in developing countries, and our focal clientele, as it were, are people who live on less than $2 a day. And it's inconceivable to us here in the middle of the Great Lakes that people may not have access to water, number one, or number two, clean water. But there's probably 1.5 billion of those people in the world for whom that's an apt description. So our purpose is to develop technologies that work for that group, generally. Let's see. Bob McDonald is our founder and past chairman. Bob was a senior executive with Dow Chemical Corporation for many years. And a part of his tour took him to the Middle East and Africa, where he oversaw all Dow's operations. When he was there, in his first trip in Lagos, Nigeria, he was stopped at a stop-and-go light, and he saw a woman taking water out of a rut next to the road, water that looks like this, and put it in a pan that she was using to cook for her kids who are right next to her. That image stuck with Bob for decades. And when he retired from Dow, he made it his purpose to try to see what he could do to ameliorate these kinds of conditions. So all of our work is, at Aqua Clara, is low tech, relatively speaking. Those of you who have been through presentations here by our colleagues in other offices, as well as those who work in the other offices, are in the midst of some very high-tech, sophisticated work. Our work is just as intensive, but we call it low-tech because we have to produce technologies that are durable, that are inexpensive, that work when we leave them to people who are to manage them, and who don't cost much. So there's over 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean water. 3.5 million people die each year from waterborne diseases around the world, and 5,000 of those die each year also who are children. It's equivalent of a couple of jumbo jets crashing every day. And then something else that we take for granted, many of these areas, as we'll be describing, have water that's contaminated by heavy metals, fluoride, and other contaminants that are ubiquitous and yet intransigent, mainly because the governments in the area don't have solutions. And when they don't have solutions, they don't admit that there's a problem. And so it perpetuates the situation in those environments. So we have a mix, an unusual mix for any kind of an organization, particularly for a nonprofit that's applying for different kinds of grants, because we have a combination of retired people like me who provide our time, talent, and sometimes treasure to a joint effort, as well as in combination with a set of professional staff. So these are some of the senior people who work with us, not just here in Holland, but around the world. We have, in addition to our location here in Holland, we have a full-time staff of 14 in Kenya. Kenya was our first international installation that was based in a town called Eldoret, which is in the western part of Kenya in tea country. And that installation was destroyed in 2007 after the first nationwide election in Kenya, when the two main tribes, tribal identities in Kenya, disputed the election. There aren't guns allowed in Kenya, but machetes are. And so there were a lot of deaths resulting. In fact, we lost our whole installation there. So we moved it a little bit south to a town called Kisii. And again, that's in the middle of the tea country. When we started, we had Mazungas, that's Swahili for white people, who were in charge of the operation. And now, after several years, the entire workforce and leadership is Kenyan. Our CEO, who's, I'm sorry, I don't have this. This is our CEO, Johnny Aguencha, and Betty Ramuga. Betty is our Chief Financial Officer. And then these are part of the senior leadership at a lunch that we had while Jay and I were visiting there last year. That's an important point here because we follow what should be the development process in international work, and that is starting something, working the local people into responsible roles, and then leaving it over to them to maintain. We have a similar operation in Nicaragua based in Managua. Mario Benavides here is a chemical engineer by training. Mario is our executive director in Nicaragua, and he has a staff as well that have other jobs, but work with us when we have projects in the country, which we pretty much do all the time. We also have former relationships with 3 institutions in Mexico and Central America, one in Querétaro, Mexico. Querétaro is a sister city of Holland, and that was how the connection was initially forged. We also have one with a technological institute in Rincon, which is in Guanajuato. And then we have a former relationship as well with the only engineering university in Honduras. So those relationships allow us to transfer our technology to relevant departments, provides for the training of students and others, as well as then the installation of our equipment and materials. So part of what we do is technology transfer. The materials and devices that we create here and we test in the field, we transfer to these locations, not just the ones that are directly supported by Aqua Clara, but also to the organizations that we partner with. And secondly, as a part of that, we only go where we're invited. So we don't have a marketing department per se, but we respond to requests for assistance. And just that process over the years has provided us with pretty much more than what we can do. And that's a reflection of the needs that are out in the world. So our technologies, I said, are low tech, but they intended to be because they have to work in these environments. So they don't require electricity, and we don't use chemicals. This is an example of the source of electricity in one of the mountain villages in Mexico we were working on. So it would be very difficult to install a reverse osmosis process here. And Bob, coming from Dow, was very familiar with the manufacture of chlorine. And chlorine, as I'm sure you know, is a common disinfectant. It's used quite a bit in water purification. Unfortunately, in these countries, there's no guarantee that any one batch of chlorine is going to be the same as the other. And sometimes what is sold as chlorine doesn't come close to it. So we don't use it at all. This is the first product that Aqua Clara came up with that was Bob patented many years ago. Before we had the benefit of this facility, Bob used the basement of the Zealand water treatment plant for his experiments. And the benefit there was he had all the raw product he needed to test out his technique, his technical work. So this is a biosand filter. The biosand filter was brought into the 20th century by an engineer in Calgary, Canada, and biosand goes back to London, the time that the Thames River was so polluted. And a basic sand filtration is what saved London back in the early 1800s. So this became the type of technology that's used many times over in developing countries. It produces water that's about 96% clean. You and I can all drink that. So that at least equals WHO standards, which is what our benchmark is. Unfortunately, most domestic biosand filters can only produce 40 to 60 liters per day, so they're very limited. Bob's contribution to this was twofold. One, these filters, and there's hundreds of thousands of these in place all over the world, are made with a concrete case. And so when fully loaded, they weigh about 350 pounds. They're not that easy to move, obviously. Although I had my senior person, when I was, the 3 years I was working in Haiti, lug those things by donkey up and down the mountains of Haiti, so it can be done. But Bob's contribution, suggested by his wife, actually, was to use plastic. One day when he was working in Zealand, in the water treatment, she said, "Bob, why are you fooling around with concrete? You're a plastics guy." So that got him off on that direction. Bob then created a protocol and a set of algorithms for loading a filter body of various sizes. That was something entirely new to the world of clean water. We still do biosand filters. They're the filter of choice for water that is the dirtiest possible. We can take water from the marshes around here and turn it into water that is drinkable by any of us. But again, the main limitation is the daily amount. So what we turned to next was hollow membrane technology. Hollow membrane was used initially for kidney dialysis. And over the years, just as computer technology has caused computer materials to become less and less expensive and more robust, so too had the technology surrounding hollow membrane filter. So the filters we use, we source from the NOC Corporation in Japan, which is one of the premier manufacturers in the country. And they consist of strands of polypropylene fiber that has 0.1 micron holes in it. And so, because most bacteria are 3 to 5 microns in size, those holes will stop the advance of the bacteria in the water. So these units that we produce, both the household, which we have on the right, and then our facility or school filters that are on your right, rather my left, clean to log 6, so 99.9999% clean, and that's better than the water that I have in that bottle over there. Again, this is low tech, and so they're not fancy. We use, typically, for our household filters, 5-gallon plastic food-grade pails. They're ubiquitous. You can get them anywhere in the world except Haiti. There we had to import them from the Dominican Republic. But so they cost about $4 wherever you go. And the installation instructions that we have are relatively straightforward, so training is, again, pretty straightforward. We have a team of our folks who travel to different places to help with the installation of our facility filters. Once that's done, then we turn that process over to the people in charge. Our second patent we secured a couple years ago. It's called a manifolded bacterial and arsenic heavy metals remediation system. And what this means is that we do two things. We first take bacteria out of the water with hollow membrane filters, and then we run the filter, or the water rather, through a media that consists of agglomerated nanoparticles of titanium dioxide that are held in 3D suspension by two different forms of silicon dioxide, or sand. What that does, it provides the water to come in contact with the titanium dioxide and increases the surface area of the media. So we've had great success with this to date, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Our last, most recent patent filing dealt with what's called a universal cartridge filter. This is intended to be used in a standard Brita or pure pitcher, and it's intended for domestic consumption. So unlike the larger installations, which are scaled from our household filter up to village size, we took this backwards and created a media that would fit into this cartridge, and that's been universally successful in all the testing that we've done. Our next set of experiments with this, we have an anion exchange media that we're going to be using on water that we access from Belmont. And with that, we're going to be able to, we're pretty confident, take out PFAS such as that's currently being experienced in that area. There are probably 16 million people in the U.S. who have the same kind of experience that those who live in the Rockford area are now encountering. We know that our technologies are sustainable. What we do in Kenya is a template for what we do in other places. We source most of our material locally. We have ongoing, not just training, but also evaluation, so that we know what each of our filters is doing, where it's located, and if there's any difficulty. And because, particularly in Kenya, we know that, we have a carbon credits contract with a major bank in Oxford, England, and we're just about to receive the latest tranche of revenue that comes from that. So we can document through a very elaborate process the effect that our filters have on limiting carbon emissions. We also partner with other organizations. We can't do all of this by ourselves, obviously, because we're small, but we can expand our reach and extend our influence by partnering with other groups. And that's been a part of the purpose of Aqua Clara since it was initiated in 2007. So we're in now over 30 countries. And this is a screenshot of our capacity report. We detail on a monthly basis, you'll see that on our website, the technologies that we have distinguished by type of technology and where they are. So right now we have over 22,000 filters in place, operating daily in these 30 countries. And the daily capacity, installed capacity, is almost 2.5 million liters per day. So I'll leave it at that.